When the flames died, the river remembered. Its surface turned calm again, but beneath the water, the ghosts of 60,000 Mongols still slept, burned, broken, and forgotten. This was not just a battle. It was the final heartbeat of an empire that believed it could not lose. At Bach Dang, the tide itself became a weapon. Steel shattered, fire drowned, and arrogance met its end. For Dai Viet, it was more than victory. It was survival written in water and blood. For the Mongols, it was a lesson carved into history. Even the mightiest empire can sink beneath its own certainty. Centuries have passed, yet the river still flows calm above, ruthless below. The stakes remain, buried under the mud, pointing upward like the memory of defiance. And as each tide rises and falls, it whispers the same question that has haunted conquerors for 1,000 years. How did water defeat fire? How did Vietnam defeat the Mongols? The morning after the flames, the Bach Dang River was silent. No more cries, no more thunder of drums, only the soft hiss of water against burned wood, the last echo of a battle that had ended empires. The tide had risen through the night, washing away the ashes of 60,000 Mongols. The current carried splinters of ships, fragments of armor, and the nameless dead out to the open sea. For a brief moment, the river itself seemed alive, breathing, swallowing, and cleansing. The surface glimmered like polished bronze under the first light of dawn. To the people of Dai Viet, it was the light of survival. To the Mongols, it was the glow of defeat. But to the river, it was simply another morning. The sky, once red with fire, was now pale and quiet. Charred masts stuck out of the water like broken bones. Birds circled above the smoke, confused by the silence. From the shore, the survivors watched in disbelief. They had fought through the night, surrounded by flames and screams, and now only the whisper of water remained. For Trần Hưng Đạo, standing on the high bank, victory brought no joy. He looked upon the wreckage, the drowned ships, the bodies tangled in oars, the fire still smouldering on the far shore, and said nothing. In his eyes, the river was both a grave and a teacher. The general had won more than a battle. He had ended a generation of fear. For 30 years, Dai Viet had fought the same enemy, an empire that had devoured half the world. From the frozen plains of Russia to the deserts of Persia, from the mountains of Korea to the walls of Baghdad, every nation that stood against the Mongols had burned. But not this one. Not here. The cost had been immense. Villages abandoned, rice fields torched, families lost. Every victory in this war had been paid with patience, with hunger, and with silence. But today, at last, the silence was theirs to keep. As the sun climbed higher, the tide began to turn once more. The wooden stakes, the same that had impaled the Mongol fleet, disappeared beneath the water. In a few hours, the river would look untouched, as if nothing had ever happened. That was the beauty and cruelty of Bach Dang. It remembered everything and revealed nothing. The soldiers of Dai Viet moved quietly through the wreckage. They did not cheer or shout. Instead, they gathered the wounded, pulled survivors from the water, and prayed for the dead, both their own and their enemies. To them, victory was not triumph, it was release. By midday, the smoke had thinned. The last Mongol ship, half burned, half sunk, drifted near the far bend before slipping beneath the surface. The current carried it away without a sound. The empire that once roared across continents now vanished beneath a river that barely appeared on their maps. In the villages along the shore, people began to emerge from hiding. They had spent the night buried in silence, listening to the thunder of battle, waiting for the tide to decide their fate. Now they came out slowly, faces hollow, eyes red from smoke. Some wept, others stared in disbelief at the blackened water. The war that had haunted them for decades had ended not with a treaty, but with fire and tide. One old fisherman approached the riverbank, his boat still tied to the same post where he had left it the day before. He looked at the water for a long time before whispering, "The river has eaten enough." No one replied. They simply nodded. Farther upstream, monks in saffron robes walked barefoot through the mud, chanting prayers for the souls of the dead. Their voices floated over the water, soft but unbroken. Even the wind seemed to listen. Trần Hưng Đạo walked among his men. They saluted, but he did not raise his hand. His face was calm, almost expressionless. One of his aides asked, "Is it over, my lord?" The general paused, watching the river. "No," he said softly, "nothing ever ends. It only changes form." He knew that the victory at Bach Dang was not the end of the war, but the beginning of a legacy, one that would define his people for centuries. He had not fought merely to destroy an army. He had fought to prove a truth, that courage and wisdom could outlast power and empire. That day, the river became a mirror of history, reflecting both triumph and tragedy. The stakes, buried once more beneath the water, were more than weapons. They were symbols of foresight, of preparation, of belief that knowledge could triumph over might. From a distance, the scene could have been mistaken for peace. A calm river, green banks, sunlight through the smoke. But for those who had seen the night, peace felt heavier than war. Some soldiers sat alone, staring at their own reflections. Others whispered the names of lost brothers. None spoke of glory. In war, glory dies first. By evening, the tide rose high again. The river that had devoured ships and men now flowed gently, as if erasing its own memory. The fire had cleansed, the water had forgiven, and the land, the small, fragile land of Dat Defied, had endured. That night, under a sky washed clean of smoke, the stars returned. They shimmered on the river's surface, broken only by ripples of drifting debris. It was beautiful and terrible, in the way that all great victories are. From his campfire, Trần Hưng Đạo watched the stars reflected on the water. He thought of the generations before him, of ancestors buried along these banks, of kings and farmers and fishermen who had lived and died for the same river. He thought of the countless enemies who had crossed it and never returned. And he realized something deeper than triumph. Empires rise and fall. Rivers remain. The next morning, the wind carried the smell of wet wood and salt. Children came to the shore again, laughing, throwing pebbles into the same water that had swallowed fleets. Life resumed. The Bach Dang River flowed on, timeless, indifferent, eternal. But beneath its calm surface lay the bones of the greatest army the world had ever seen, and the unspoken wisdom of a people who had learned to turn water into war. And somewhere, deep in the current, where fire once met tide, the river still whispered, a soft, endless refrain that no empire could silence. Remember what arrogance forgets. Even the sky must bow to the tide. In the northern capital of Dadu, winter had already arrived. The wind from the steppes howled through the marble corridors of the palace, cold, sharp, and ancient. Inside, the great Khan sat in silence. Before him lay a map of the world, marked by the conquests of his ancestors. From the frozen Volga to the sands of Persia, from the Korean peninsula to the gates of Baghdad, every corner of that map bore the scar of Mongol victory. Everywhere, except for one small patch of green in the far south. Divit, 3 times he had sent armies there. 3 times they had vanished. The courtiers dared not speak. Only the faint crackle of a brazier broke the silence. In his old age, Kublai Khan had grown slower, heavier, but his mind was still sharp, sharp enough to feel the wound of humiliation. He had conquered the greatest empire of his time, forged unity across continents, ruled over 1/5 of the known world. And yet, somewhere beyond the jungles and rivers, a kingdom he could barely find on a map had defied him not once, but 3 times. The messenger knelt before him, trembling. "Your Majesty, the fleet is lost. General Omar is dead. Prince Togun has not returned." No one dared look up. Kublai said nothing. He simply stared at the map, at that small patch of green, And then, at his own trembling hand, for the first time in a lifetime of conquest, the great Khan could not find the words for victory. He rose slowly, the sound of his armor echoing in the vast hall. "Enough," he said at last, voice low and cold. "There will be no fourth invasion." Those who heard him later wrote that his tone was not anger, it was resignation, a realization that the tide of empire, like the tide of the river, could not rise forever. In Dai Viet, the people did not see an empire's fall. They saw only peace. Farmers returned to their fields, rebuilding what had been burned. The smell of smoke was replaced by the scent of rice and wet earth. Children played by the river again. The war was over, but in the quiet of their hearts, they knew the world had changed. Because when a small nation defeats the greatest empire in the world, the story never ends with victory, it begins with memory. To the Mongols, Bach Dang was an accident. To Dai Viet, it was destiny fulfilled. Across Asia, the legend spread, how a general turned tides into weapons, how fire drowned and steel broke, how patience defeated speed and knowledge defeated pride. In Persia, scholars compared it to the Battle of Ain Jalut, the first time the Mongols had been stopped by another army. In China, poets wrote of the River of Burning Ships, and in the Mongol chronicles, the page that should have told this story was left blank. The empire that could not be conquered had finally met a people that could not be ruled. The Mongols had fought every kind of enemy cavalry on the steppes, knights of Europe, archers of Persia, and had crushed them all. But here they met something they could not understand, a people who fought not for expansion, not for revenge, but for existence itself. For Dai Viet, the war was never about conquest. It was about survival, not just of land, but of identity. A culture built on rivers and rice fields, not deserts and horses. A kingdom too small to dominate the world, but too proud to be forgotten by it. When Trần Hưng Đạo designed his traps, he was not only defending his country, he was defending the rhythm of a civilization that had always flowed like water bending, never breaking. Even centuries later, that idea remained. Empires come and go, but a people who understand the flow of their own land can outlast any army. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Mongol world, the cracks began to show. After Bach Dang, the empire's momentum faltered. The invasions of Japan had already failed. The campaigns in Southeast Asia drained men and gold. Each expedition ended the same way, defeated not by armies, but by oceans, jungles, disease, and time. The invincible empire began to rust. For the first time, Kublai's generals questioned his vision. The world, it seemed, could not be conquered by one man's will alone. Within decades, rebellions broke out. The vast machine that had united Asia splintered into fragments: Yuan in China, Ilkhanate in Persia, Golden Horde in Russia. Each one claimed the legacy of Genghis Khan, but none could live up to it. And yet, in the small kingdom that had once defied them, the memory of the river remained. When future emperors of Dai Viet walked past the waters of Bach Dang, they bowed their heads, not in sorrow, but in reverence for the wisdom that saved their nation. History is cruel in its irony. The Mongols, who once believed that strength alone could rule the world, were undone by the same force that had made them powerful: their faith in momentum. They believed that victory was inevitable, that the world was meant to bend before their riders. But they never learned how to stop moving forward. And in the jungles and rivers of Southeast Asia, where speed meant nothing and patience meant everything, that arrogance turned to ash. Bach Dang was more than a defeat, it was a mirror. It showed that the same force that builds empires can also destroy them. That an empire without understanding is an army without a map. For Trần Hưng Đạo, the lesson was simpler. He wrote that if one knows the enemy and knows the land, one need not fear 100 battles. It was not pride that guided him, it was awareness. He knew that Dai Viet could never match the Mongols in size or strength, so he fought them with something deeper: intelligence. When the Mongols relied on force, he relied on time. When they brought horses, he brought rivers. When they built power, he built patience. And in the end, time, water, and patience devoured the empire that had devoured the world. In the centuries that followed, the Mongols faded into history. Their palaces crumbled, their sons fought among themselves, and their language vanished into the wind. But the river remained. It carried no flags, no names, only the quiet rhythm of survival. Somewhere, deep in its current, the stakes still stood, darkened by silt, wrapped in algae, waiting. They no longer killed, they simply remembered. And perhaps that is the truest measure of power, not how many nations you can conquer, but how long your story endures after you're gone. At Bach Dang, the empire that ruled the world met a people who ruled the water, and when empire met river, empire drowned. The Mongols believed they were eternal, but eternity, it seems, belonged to the tide. Centuries have passed, and the river has forgotten the sound of war. The cries of men, the roar of fire, the clash of iron, all swallowed by the steady rhythm of the tide. Today, the Bach Dang flows quietly between mangrove forests and rice fields. To the fishermen who cast their nets here, it is only water, calm, brown, familiar. But beneath its surface lies the memory of 1,000 years. Every tide that rises and falls carries whispers from that day in 1288. Whispers of wooden stakes that pierced through ships of empire, of flames reflected on the water, of voices calling through the smoke. The river keeps its secrets well, but sometimes, when the tide is low and the mud breathes, fragments of history return. Dark, jagged wood breaks through the surface, blackened, worn smooth by centuries of current. They are the stakes of Bach Dang, the silent witnesses of an empire's fall. Unearthed by time, they stand like ancient teeth of the earth, still pointing upward as if waiting for another fleet to come. Archaeologists call them relics, but to those who stand by the river's edge, they are not relics, they are memories made solid. Each one carved by hands that no longer exist, yet still reaching through the centuries to remind the living that even water can remember. On misty mornings, when the fog drifts low over the river, it is easy to imagine the shapes of old ships in the distance, phantom sails gliding across the surface. The air smells of salt and earth, the same scent that once clung to armor and ash. Time folds quietly here. The past is never gone, it only hides beneath the ripples. In the small village of Yenjiang, where some of the original stakes were found, the people still tell stories passed down by their ancestors. Stories of a general who commanded the tides, of soldiers who vanished into the water and never returned, of a night when the river itself became fire. Children listen with wide eyes, not realizing that they are living beside one of history's greatest traps and its greatest triumphs. There is no monument here greater than the river itself, no marble statue, no towering fortress. Only water, flowing endlessly, patient and eternal. That, perhaps, is the truest memorial. Because, unlike stone, which stands still, water moves. It carries memory forward. It teaches in silence. In modern museums, the stakes of Bach Dang stand behind glass, tall, dark, scarred by flame and time. People walk past them without knowing that these simple pieces of wood once changed the fate of nations. They lean close, reading the small plaques, iron-tipped stakes used to trap the Mongol fleet, 1288. Few realize that these were not mere weapons. They were the embodiment of an idea that wisdom, patience, and knowledge of one's land can triumph over any army. Each stake was placed with precision. Each one represented a moment of choice to resist, to endure, to believe. Together, they became a wall that no empire could cross. They remind us that even simple things, guided by understanding, can become unstoppable forces. Standing before them, one can almost hear the echo of the drums, the cries across the river, the rush of tide and flame. Then silence again, the silence that comes only after the impossible has been achieved. In the heart of Vietnamese memory, the Battle of Bach Dang is more than history, it is identity. Every child learns the story not as a tale of conquest, but as a lesson in resilience. Because it tells them that greatness is not measured by how much land you rule, but by how much you refuse to surrender. Through centuries of foreign rule, civil war, and renewal, the river remained flowing beside new kings, new flags, new struggles. Dynasties fell, emperors rose, but the tide still moved in the same rhythm. It watched everything, remembered everything, and forgot nothing. Sometimes the old fishermen say the river still hungers, not for blood, but for remembrance. They say, when the fog is thick and the current turns against the wind, you can hear faint drums beneath the water, not a haunting, but a heartbeat. The sound of a people who refuse to drown. Scholars and travelers who visit Bach Dang often ask the same question. How could a small kingdom defeat the mightiest empire on earth? The answers are many: strategy, geography, timing, luck. But perhaps the truest answer lies in the river itself. For the Mongols, the river was an obstacle, something to be crossed, dominated, overcome. For Trần Hưng Đạo, it was an ally, alive, unpredictable, and eternal. He did not fight against nature. He fought with it. That understanding made the difference between destruction and survival. It is a lesson that outlived empires. Power fades, kingdoms crumble, but the wisdom of knowing one's land, of listening to its rhythm, endures. As twilight falls over the delta, the river glows gold under the sinking Sunday. Children laugh by the water's edge, their reflections rippling like ghosts of warriors long gone. Somewhere beneath their feet, the stakes still rest, heavy with history. The current passes over them gently, as if unwilling to disturb their sleep. The world above has changed beyond recognition, cars on distant highways, power lines stretching across the sky. But the river remains the same, and deep below, in that dark, quiet water, lies the soul of a nation that learned how to turn defeat into defiance. To stand here is to feel time collapse, to realize that what once burned now nourishes, that what once drowned now sustains, that the ashes of battle became the soil of identity. The Bach Dang River does not boast, it does not roar. It simply flows, whispering through reeds and mangroves, carrying with it a story the world should never forget. A story of patience against fury, of water against fire, of a people who understood that true power lies not in domination, but in endurance. Every empire believes it will last forever. Every empire learns that nothing does. But somewhere, hidden beneath the mud and silt of time, the stakes still stand dark, silent, unbroken. And as the tide rises to cover them once more, the river smiles its ancient, secret smile, because it remembers what the world forgets. Empires fall, rivers remain, and beneath every quiet current, history waits. History is not made of battles alone. It is made of choices of people who stood at the edge of the impossible and decided to fight anyway. At Bach Dang, a small nation faced the world's greatest empire. They had no towering fortresses, no endless armies, no divine miracle. All they had was understanding of the river, of time, of themselves. And somehow, that was enough. Trần Hưng Đạo did not conquer the Mongols by force. He conquered them with patience. He fought not against nature, but with it, listening to the rhythm of the tides, turning the flow of the earth itself into his ally. It was not a victory of swords, but of wisdom. And that wisdom still flows beneath the waters of Vietnam today. The empire that believed it could not be stopped was brought down not by power, but by insight. And that is the story the river continues to tell, a story, not of how the Mongols burned, but of how a people learned. Because in the end, every empire meets its river. Every force meets the one thing it cannot command: time, patience, and the will of those who refuse to bow. Power fades, armies disappear, but understanding endures. The Bach Dang River still flows, silent and eternal, carrying the reflection of that truth. And if you listen closely, you might still hear the echo of that ancient tide, the murmur of a nation that whispered to the greatest empire in the world. You cannot conquer what understands itself. That is why history matters. Not just to remember what happened, but to understand why.